Okay, so Deer Month was supposed to end in April, and I'm not going to go into extreme detail about what's happened. I've had some health problems, had family living with me, so it's ending now. It's a couple months late, but that's to be expected. Life doesn't always go the way you want. With that said, let's wrap up Deer Month with a full review of the O'Hurley series. The O'Hurleys. In 1988, three books that would be affectionately coined as the O'Hurley series were released, with the fourth and final coming out in 1990. These books, The Last Honest Woman, Dance to the Piper, Skin Deep, and Without a Trace, are seen by many as one of Nora Roberts' best works in romance. As I said, obviously, Deer Month ended in April, but due to unforeseen circumstances, it's trickled over a little bit. This hasn't stopped me from giving these four books a thorough look through, and asking if this series is good now as it was when it was initially released. I'm going to go about this a little differently. I'll grade each book, but I'll also grade the series as a whole, starting out with the first in the group, The Last Honest Woman. The O'Hurleys consist of three triplet girls, Abigail, Madeline, and Chantel, and their older brother Trace. Their parents, Frank and Molly, operate a kind of family act where their kids sing and perform. This is the background for each of these novels, and it plays heavily into how these girls see the world around them. Abby was the quiet one of the four, and married off young to a famous motorist, Chuck Rockwell. Years later, after he's killed in an accident on the speedway, a journalist by the name of Dylan Crosby appears, wanting to write about him in a biography. This book, I feel, is nice ground for Roberts because Abby is, by all means, a really good female lead. She isn't loud and obnoxious, but she isn't a complete passive pushover. She can get angry. She's also very mature, considering all that she's been through. She has two children by her late husband, one of which was conceived through rape after Chuck came home drunk and forced himself on her. And despite her husband refusing to acknowledge his son because of his conception, Abby tells Dylan that she loves both of her boys equally and thinks that her son Chris is beautiful. She doesn't see the horror of his conception, she sees the beauty that it created. Abby also finds very little joy in the spotlight, despite being famous in her youth, and is content living on her farm with her sons. She's one of Robert's best female leads, if not her very best, because she isn't a cunt, but she isn't Little Miss Perfect. She's flawed, but she's relatable, and she also has a big enough heart to forgive her husband despite the fact that he cheated on her, raped her, and treated her like an afterthought. She maintains a great deal of civility towards him for the sake of their sons, and even when she opens up to Dylan about what she's endured, she's very matter-of-fact. She doesn't over-embellish, and she's honest without being melodramatic. Dylan is okay too. He's no Eli, and I feel like Abby overshadows him, but he's a decent guy who comes to the ranch in search of a story and learns more about Abby than he bargained for. It's also interesting that the book he's writing hinges on a number of factors. Despite Chuck being a drug addict and a womanizer, Chuck's grieving mother won't allow Dylan to besmirch her son's name. On top of that, Abby doesn't want the boys hating their father. So, he has to decide how he's going to go about writing this story, with Abby's family, Chuck's family, and Chuck's lawyers all putting pressure on him. Now, the book does have some of Robert's telltale mannerisms, sappy dialogue being the worst of it. But overall, it's a great book, and it's very mature. It could have easily strayed into melodramatic territory, but it didn't. That's what the middle two books of this series are for. Next up, we have Dance to the Piper. If Abby was the singer of the group, Madeline was the dancer. All three of these sisters are triple threats, but they have their own little niche that sets them apart from one another. In this book, Maddie has finally made it big on Broadway, making it into a much anticipated play as a dancer. She ends up falling for the play's financial backer, Reed Valentine, who has the dumbest fucking name since Anastasia Steele, and it all goes downhill from there. And by downhill, I mean it plateaus, because this shit is predictable. Girl and guy like each other, they fall in love, guy runs girl off because he's worried he's bad for her, girl comes back and confesses her love, causing him to finally give in and confess to her, and they all live happily ever after, blah, blah, blah. There is an interesting backstory between Reed's father and Maddie's parents, but it all boils down to Reed's father was hurt by Reed's mother, Reed doesn't want to get hurt like his father did, so he refuses to commit. Now, this could be a decent backstory if Reed wasn't an asshole and pretentious. He even goes as far as to propose to Maddie, but says that it's just a formality and they'll get the license and carry on like nothing's happened. I'm pretty sure when I read that, my eyes rolled so hard they popped out of my skull. I wish there was more for me to rip into here, but really there isn't. It's like eating tofu on a rice cake sprinkled with a little paprika. It's just bland, predictable bullshit with a little tidbit of spice. But that spice doesn't keep me interested in what I'm eating for very long. Alright, number 3 on our list is Skin Deep. Remember that rice cake? Well, instead of a rice cake with tofu, scrape that tofu off and just ram it up your ass a few dozen times. You'll get the gist of how agitating this book is to read. Chantel is the actress of the group, and as an adult, she's a famous celebrity with a stalker. She hires a bodyguard, they fall in love, her dark past is revealed. They confess her their love after she's kidnapped by her crazy stalker, who's your stereotypical delusional maniac, and then the story ends. This wouldn't have been such a chore for me to read if Chantel wasn't on the test court side of the Nora Roberts spectrum. Have a stalker chasing you? Hire a bodyguard and then fight with him. How about you refuse to call the police despite him insisting you to do so? Hell, when Quinn asks for the names of her past lovers so we can get an idea of who her stalker may be, she tells him to go to hell. She's uncooperative, unlikable, and aggravating. Chantel is a shit and blood-smeared rice cake shoved up the anal passage of every poor bastard that's dumb enough to give this book a chance. It's the worst of the series by far, and I'll go as far as to say it's Nora Roberts' worst book to date. Yeah, worse than Sacred Sins. At least with Sacred Sins, it had potential to be good. Here, I don't think Roberts even tried. Though I will give this book some credit, I don't hate it as much as I hate Sacred Sins. So, good for it. Last, and least, we have Without a Trace. This is an odd read because it isn't her standard romance. Unlike the last 3, this was released in the 90s and is a spy thriller, which kinda makes sense because Trace himself was always the black sheep of his family. Hell, this book is dedicated to black sheep. So, Trace left home at a young age because he wanted more in life than to be backup drummer for his family's traveling circus. You get the standard father and son having a falling out trope before Trace runs off and gets caught up in spy espionage. We meet him years later as a burned out drunk, propositioned by Gillian Fitzpatrick to save her family after they're kidnapped. I didn't go into great detail with Dance to the Piper and Skin Deep because there really wasn't much there. And Without a Trace, giving away too much will give away the fun of reading this book. Roberts did an interview with Borders a while back, talking about how romance is great because you can blend it with so many different genres. Without a Trace works because she does a fantastic job of writing mystery and suspense, while also sprinkling a little romance in. Does Trace or Gillian stand out much? Not really. Gillian is a scientist, and Trace is a grizzled bastard who doesn't give a shit. But that doesn't mean the book isn't fun to read. I enjoyed it immensely. And also, yeah, I get the pun on the title, Without a Trace. His name's Trace. Ha ha ha. In the end, not only does this novel wrap up the series, but we finally see Trace and his father make amends. Throughout the entire series, Frank has nothing nice to say about his son. He's always talking shit about him. Every time Trace is brought up in any of the other books, he gets very pissy. So it's nice to see them finally make amends. And Frank admits that it was his fault for their falling out, which it was. Maybe it was dickish of Trace to disappear and never come around, but Frank was the one who flipped when his son didn't want to play little drummer boy. Without a Trace is a very tasty cherry atop a very lopsided cake. Overall, the rating of these books is as follows. The Last Honest Woman gets an A. It's not A+ material for me. Like I said, the dialogue is kinda sappy, in my opinion, and it can detract from things, but the book as a whole is very mature, very well written, which usually isn't a problem for Roberts, and I love every character involved in it. Dance to the Piper gets a C. I don't hate it, it's just not good. It's very predictable, run-of-the-mill romance. Roberts can do better, but I've seen her do worse. Next up, we have Skin Deep, which, of course, gets an F. As I said, speaking of worse, this is the worst. I don't think I've ever seen a Nora Roberts novel so poorly executed. The characters are shitheads, the story's predictable, and it feels like Roberts didn't even bother trying. It really feels like she just did not care. And finally, we have Without a Trace, which I'm gonna give a B+. Nothing remarkable, but it's definitely a guilty pleasure. It's well written, everything's the way it should be, and it was just fun to read. I also really liked that it was a bit of a break from the rest of the series. It wasn't a straightforward romance, it had its own little genre, and I really liked that. As for this series as a whole, I'm gonna give it a B-. I can't, in good conscience, give it a C, but Skin Deep and Dance to the Piper drag it down pretty far. It's kind of odd, since these 4 books best represent my love-hate relationship towards Roberts' work. She can be fun and intuitive, but she can also be predictable or downright awful. However, considering this woman publishes 5 books a year, she's bound to turn out a few stinkers from time to time. Overall, I have a lot of respect for Nora Roberts. She's an inspiration to many writers, and she deserves all the acclaim she's gained. Is she perfect? No. But I'm happy she's not. How boring would Dear Month be if I kept dishing out A's without any variation? Alright guys, well, Dear Month is finally over. Thank you a lot for hanging in there. I don't plan on doing book reviews for a while. I feel like I'd burn myself out a little bit. However, I do have a movie review coming up. It's gonna be really awesome. I look forward to it, and it's a lot of fun. I love reviewing public domain movies. So, I look forward to getting that out to you, and I will see you guys next time.